Okay, Dad, today is Wednesday, April 17th, and today I want to talk about Ukraine some. But before we jump into that, are there any updates with regard to the Israel Iran showdown?
Well, we're still waiting to see if Israel is going to respond to the Iranian retaliation. We're getting mixed signals from the government, but on the whole, it seems likely that they will respond in some fashion. Maybe it won't be on a large scale. Maybe it'll be somewhere down the road. Maybe it'll just be another one of these assassinations, that they've been carrying out in Syria, for example. And this time we'll just call it retaliation. We'll just have to wait and see.
So you said there are mixed signals. What are the signals that you can
Well,
see?
we had, I think, at one point, Netanyahu indicated that, okay, yeah, there was no need to. He accepted, Biden's argument that that he was going to take the win and leave it there. But then later, he and other government officials had said no, that something has to be done. I'm sure that he's under very intense pressure. I mean, he's from within his own cabinet and just in Israel in general. It's going to be hard for him not to retaliate in some way. I mean, it's just sort of it's a given. This has been Israel's policy for decades. Is that just to counter or to respond to any sort of attack, with overwhelming force, disproportionate force, as a matter of fact. So, if in fact, if he goes ahead and does something that's not all that spectacular, some people within Israel, or quite a few, may say that, okay, he was weak.
Is the pressure coming more within the Knesset, within the political leadership, or how is it coming from how do Israeli citizens feel? Because I have a feeling a lot of them should be getting scared,
Right.
and maybe they're lying to themselves at first, but I think a lot of people have to realize that we've been hit and we're not invulnerable anymore. The whole
Right. Well,
rules
actually,
that
this is like the second incident in the last approximately 6 months that is kind of just really done away with that Israeli aura of invulnerability.
mm,
And that's been, the first, of course, was October 7th. And that was a tremendous shock to the Israeli psyche. And this one, I don't know exactly how people in Israel are understanding it. Maybe because, certainly within the West, we're hearing again and again that this was just an amazing, demonstration of Israel's technology, of its, they've shown that they are in fact invulnerable, to air attacks. That's kind of the message that's being given, and perhaps that's happening within Israel. But just based on my experience, there's actually tends to be more truthfulness told within Israel about these matters than what we get, what we're fed within the Western countries. And so there's probably some awareness of the vulnerabilities that attack
mm.
exposed. I don't know enough. I haven't been
I
following the politics recently to know for sure.
I
And
saw some poll that showed that the majority of Israelis did not support a retaliation without the backing of its allies, the United States,
uh-huh.
something like 70%. So obviously,
Okay,
I think people want the war, but they don't. They realize they can't go at it alone.
right.
And I don't know if we discussed this in the last podcast, but what is Israel's even ability to attack Iran without the support of the United States?
Um, yeah, my understanding is that they have that they can launch missiles from two kinds of platforms. They can either fire them from aircraft or from submarines. And the aircrafts are a problem because, again, Iran's quite a distance from Israel. It's roughly 1,000 miles away. So that's a 2,000 mile round trip. And apparently, to accomplish a mission like that, it would be necessary to refuel in air, and they don't have that capability. That's what my understanding is. So for that kind of attack, they would need the United States. Now they could launch missiles from a submarine. I think maybe that's a viable option. Um, but those are the two.
Okay. So we're just going to have to sit and wait and see.
Yeah, again, assuming that they're going to do an attack on the territory of Iran.
Okay.
And if they do, of course, they're going to risk further escalation from Iran.
Okay, well, something that we talked about a month ago on the podcast, we're talking about how we think the war in Ukraine could end. And
Yeah,
something that I mentioned was the possibility of Ukraine turning on its handlers. And I've been seeing some news stories that makes me feel like this is the route that we're
yeah,
going down. Something that I saw was Zelensky is very upset, and I would say rightfully so, because he saw the amount of support that Israel got for its incoming missile barrage and these drone strikes. The French, the British, the Ally, the United
right,
States, or the Jordanian Air Force, they all got together and banded together and shot down the majority of these incoming missiles and drones.
right,
And Zelensky's like, hey, why haven't you been doing this for me? Israel is not a member of NATO. You have no obligation
right,
to. You're the one that told us to start this war, to put, to go forward, to not
right,
negotiate for peace. Why can't we get the support?
right,
Obviously, I think the answer is very clear. It's because the United States doesn't want a war with Russia.
right.
But you can see where the Ukrainians, how they're feeling abandoned.
Uh-huh.
What do you think the likelihood of the Ukrainian government turning on the United States?
Yeah, I think we're still a long ways from that. I think that may only happen when they're faced with total defeat. And well,
How
again,
far
well,
away?
that may not be a long ways away, but we're still not there yet. Okay, they're still fighting. The war isn't over, but it may be when, yeah, when they're faced with the necessity of surrender. That actually that's going to come to that. It's usually in wars. It's just. Um, People will fight to the end, but when the end comes, then there really is reassessment. That's the point when the finger pointing. Well, there may be some finger pointing ahead of time, but a real, um, serious questioning of all the motives. It just you would hope that would happen earlier, but it doesn't.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, where were we?
Okay, yeah, we're just talking about the chance of the Ukrainians turning on their handlers, so to speak.
Mm,
And when was that
right.
likely to happen? And I was just saying that that kind of real reversal, it typically doesn't happen until the very end. When a country
Right.
is utterly defeated and surrenders, and then
Well,
you find, there's a lot of recriminations and self-examination, and people really start to openly ask the questions. When they're still in the heat of war, it's very hard for people to do that. You would hope that they would, but they just don't. There's a tendency, because the questioner can always be accused of kind of undermining, like, the troops at the front, of harming morale, and nobody wants to be accused of being the person that somehow is responsible for a defeat. So everybody's motivated to continue to support, to wave the flag until the end. But when the defeat is finally comes, it's clear, it's over. That same kind of pressure tends to evaporate, and then you have people looking at each other and say, like, okay, we messed up. Where did we go wrong? What should we have done? And it may be at that point I say, okay, we chose the wrong side. I think that's what Aristovich said.
how close are we to that? I mean, it
Well,
seems like
that's
we're really close.
yeah. Well, we may be. It's hard to say, but you may be right. I guess earlier I used that the metaphor of a building with a hollowed out foundation, and that's what happens in a war of attrition. It's just the other side. In this case, the Russians, they keep on chipping away at the foundation, and you don't see much happening, but then cracks appear and then the whole building comes tumbling down. So it could be pretty fast when it happens, and there's certainly indications. Like, you can see the cracks now. There's the Russians; they're not advancing quickly. It's not like they're advancing 10 kilometers a day or whatever. But they're advancing faster than they have before. There seems to be, it's an accelerating trend. It seems like with every passing week, they seem to go a little bit faster than they did the previous week. It's still, we're sort of like, we're going from 0 to 1 to 2 miles an hour. We're not near anywhere close to 60, but that's an indication, right? That yeah, that um, yeah, that we're approaching that, maybe approaching that tipping point. And then I think maybe even more suggestive is some recent stories of surrenders and disbanded brigades
Right.
and
That's what I was going to.
insubordination on the Ukrainian side, the kind of things that you never heard about before. And so that suggests that very low morale on the Ukrainian side.
Right. I heard that a whole battalion surrendered recently, and it was a one of the sort of Banderite neo-Nazi battalions. It was one of these much more.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure if it was that one. I think what I've heard is that there were okay. There were. It may have been. Okay, I'm sorry. I
Yeah,
may.
I'm
Okay, there was.
not positive, but
Yeah, there was one. Okay, I know there was one in Chasiv. I think it was the Third Assault Brigade, which was actually, formerly the Azov Brigade, and that they were told to go into Chasiv, and they just refused.
hmm,
And then General Sirski gave the order to disband them. Again, this was a brigade that was very close to General Zaluzhny before, and again, a far right brigade. Another one is I don't know what it's been renamed now, but it was known as the Right Sector, and I believe that one too has been disbanded again for similar reasons, for insubordination. And then okay, there was a third brigade, where you say that at least the rumors are is that an entire battalion or something of that brigade surrendered, and that brigade too was disbanded.
So it looks like there's a lot of trouble brewing. If there's open insubordination on the front, more people surrendering, and then there's also recently this mobilization law that got passed that is very unpopular. And from my understanding, the mobilization law that got passed will not allow Ukrainian soldiers that were serving to ever get rotate off into the rest period. They're supposed to work. I forget how many, like 18 months in cycle or something like this.
Right. I think it maybe had been extended to 3 years, but then it's now extended indefinitely.
Definitely, right.
Right. So once you're sent to the front, there's just no going home. You either die there or you
wait till the war's over.
War's over, right?
So and you can see how unpopular this is. People that have been waiting to be able to go back home to their families, they've been on the front. If they've survived this long, and now they're told there is no going back. You're staying here indefinitely. I think anybody between the age of 18 and 60 has to have the military ID. If you, they don't even have, I guess, the manpower to kind of round them up so much. So they just say, if you don't show up, then you're automatically, a criminal and
a fugitive.
Right. So hugely unpopular. I see videos of men trying to escape, going across the border into Romania, and they're hauled back in trucks and beat. And clearly these people don't want to fight. So what the people that you're putting will have very little training. They don't have the will to fight. Clearly, all the ones that did have the will to fight are dead or have lost that will. And so I just don't. I was thinking, maybe they could drag this onto the election. I'm starting to get the feeling it's not going to even last till summer. I think by July, the way it's going.
You may very well be right. And I guess it's partly because I've heard, predictions of an imminent collapse for 2 years now. I remember actually in early 2022, somebody, pointing to some incidents on the front and saying, well, this may signal, an imminent collapse on the Ukrainian side. And obviously wasn't true. But of course, things have changed.
Right.
I mean, really, one thing is what happened then is that, often the Russians really were pummeling the Ukrainians to the front line, but there were a lot of reserves. And so one thing is that the Ukrainians did is said, okay, maybe the Russians completely wiped out a unit, maybe an entire brigade or something, but they had another brigade behind and just filled the gap. And they were able to do that again and again and again. But now, they just don't have those reserves. And, for example, we're talking about Chasiv, where Sirski tried to get the Third Assault Brigade to move in there, and they simply refused. Now what they're doing is apparently moving units from far in the north at Kupiansk and sending them down there. And of course, by doing that, because there's a lot of fear that that the Russians are going to launch an offensive in that area. Kupiansk is up in the Kharkov region.
Mm-hmm.
They weakened their lines up there in order to reinforce their forces in Chasiv Yar. Those are the kind of decisions they have to make now. Before they didn't have to do that. They could keep the entire line, um, fully manned. They were able to keep all the units up to strength all along the line. They can't now, so they're just making these hard choices. Weakening the line here in order to hold the line there, and then, but of course, when you weaken the line in one place, then the Russians can always start applying more pressure there.
Right. So they're short on manpower,
Right.
and there's no real replacement for that. I mean, unless Macron sends his couple thousand French people, which French troops, but that's unlikely to happen. And if it does, it's not going to make a difference.
Right. Yeah. And then, how motivated are they going to be too? I doubt that they want to be there. And then they have the same problems: is that it doesn't solve the problem of Russian air superiority. I mean, the Russians now completely control the skies, and they're able to, to bomb and even supply very close, air support to the troops right there on the front lines. It's something that they weren't able to do because of the strong air defenses that Ukraine used to have. They don't have them now, so and neither do they have an air force.
And then the other question as well is they're losing the war in terms of manpower. They're also losing it considerably in terms of munitions. Like, they don't have an air defense system, and there's no chance of them getting an air defense system at this point.
Right.
I mean, the U.S. isn't able to, even if the U.S. wanted to, and NATO, they're not. We don't have the ability to even provide and produce the munitions.
Right.
I read or I heard actually from, I think it was Colonel Douglas McGregor, said that we only produce 550 Patriot missiles a year.
Right.
That's it. That's our air defense system.
Right.
And so you can see that you can send 500 small Shahed drones, and then there goes the whole supply.
Right.
Of
I can remember
missiles.
it may have been a whole year ago or so, but there was. I remember seeing a video of. It was a Patriot launcher, I think, in the Kiev area, and you could actually count them, over 30 interceptors fired in the course of about a minute and a half. So, that right there is, close to 10% of what the U.S. can produce in a year.
Right.
And each one of those was a couple $1 million. It was just, so it's, you see, of course, right. So they were up against these hard limits. And then obviously there's going to be a demand to keep the Israelis well supplied. And the Israelis are always going to be at the front of the line.
Right. And this is another more reason why I feel like the likelihood of Ukraine turning on its handlers, turning on NATO and the United States, is because of this. They will see that they are no longer, that the Western leaders will realize that, then I think they already know that the war in Ukraine is lost. And so they're going to stop giving support and just kind of slowly walk away. I think that was one of our first episodes, was will the U.S. just walk away? I'm starting to think that will be more and more likely. They may try to give token little bits of money and pieces of old equipment that aren't going to do anything. But we are going to walk away. And when that happens, and I think Ukraine will turn, and it could be just a huge disaster for Biden. I can just see it if Zelensky, I don't know if Zelensky will ever be able to make peace with Putin. Yeah. He might be too far gone.
Right.
But if he gets overthrown or whatever, but just also imagine the amount of dirt that the Ukrainians will be able to expose, show the world what the U.S. and NATO was doing.
Right.
We talked about in the very beginning this idea that there were, the fact that there were 12 CIA bases right on the border of Russia in Ukraine. And the New York Times wrote an article about it saying that. And, when we first heard, there's a couple of CIA bases, when you realize that it's very rare to have any CIA bases in the country, and if you do one or two, the fact that there's 12 in a country, I don't think any other country has that many CIA bases.
Right. I
Right.
think Larry Johnson is the ex CIA analyst. Yeah, he pointed out like when he was in the CIA, the country with the most CIA bases was West Germany, and it had 6 bases. So 12 was just unheard of. And yeah, so it gives you an idea of the extent of the U.S. involvement there.
Were these bases, have the Russians captured them, or have we just moved them back? Like,
I
this is what I'm
Yeah,
curious.
right.
Like,
I don't think they have.
I'm ready.
Right.
I'm waiting for the scandals, and I feel like they're going to start to break, and they're going to come heavy once Ukraine turns on the United States,
Right.
which I personally think that's inevitable.
Okay.
I think
Yeah. Well, I can see. I certainly can see that. You can see signs of it already. There's been a lot of angry words directed at the U.S. from Ukraine. Yeah.
I mean,
in
imagine
recent
the
days.
population, not even the government, just
Right.
that you sent my son to
Right,
die.
right.
My husband's never coming home now.
Right.
Like all of these people
Right.
that just had their lives destroyed, and they were lied to.
Right.
We were given this promise, and then when things are getting really bad, you walk away from us and give everything to Israel. Everybody just cares about Israel, and you are shooting missiles down for Israel, but you wouldn't do that for us for over 2 years.
Right.
Like,
of
you
course,
can
there actually is a rational. It's not just
right.
a matter of
I understand.
Right.
They don't want to go to war with Russia. Russia
Right.
made it clear, if you do that, then you're part of this war, and we will,
Right.
we're going after you. But you can just see it from the Ukrainian point
Sure.
of view. They, at the end of the day, they were just told to stick with the U.S. and stick with NATO, and everything is just going to be just a path of roses, and you're going to get to the pot of gold at the other side.
Right.
And it's all been a lie, and the people in Ukraine have to be seeing it. So I imagine there's got to be a huge amount of just anger just brewing there.
Right.
And it's got to be brewing in Zelensky as well. He's trying to walk this line, be like, hey, we really need your help, but doesn't try to be too needy and not trying to be too. But he has no choice.
Right.
He has. His only option at some point, I think, will be to work with the Russians and turn on the Americans, or get assassinated, or get thrown out.
That's the thing. It's okay. Yeah, I think there's no question there's going to be a lot of anger towards the Americans and the Ukrainian government officials may very well, probably will lash out at the Americans. But don't forget that this ideology that is that is so powerful within Ukraine, the Banderite ideology, is if nothing else anti-Russian. It's all about hating Russia, it seems, more than anything else. So it's going to be hard for these people, as long as the Banderites have power there, it's going to be very hard for them to make a deal with Russia. But stranger things have happened.
Well, yeah, if the Banderites, most of their support ends up, they're mostly dead because they were in these Azov battalions, right. And there's not many of them left.
That's true, because actually, interestingly, right, it seems like Zelensky and Skirsky are actually trying to, well, they are disbanding these units. They see them as a threat. They know that they're very closely allied with Zelensky. And so who knows, because of this infighting, just because, Zelensky's trying to save his own hide, he may end up weakening the Banderites in a significant way. And that could be, well, that's a reason for hope. There's
To anyone listening who doesn't understand what Banderite means, can you explain?
Yeah.
I only have kind of a rough one.
Right. Well, Stefan Bandera, that's what it refers to. He was a West Ukrainian nationalist who allied himself very closely with the Nazis and essentially, shared their ideology. And when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union at that time, when they arrived in West Ukraine, he actively cooperated, with his own forces, and I don't think there's really any controversy about this, carried out a number of atrocities against Jews, against Russians, against Poles in particular, but also, fellow Ukrainians who didn't share his ideology. And I don't know exactly what the numbers are, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that he killed. And yeah, it was an ideology that never really died, because after the Soviet Union reestablished control over those territories, and after the defeat of Nazi Germany, um, there was actually a real effort by the Western powers, by the U.S. in particular, to support the Banderites that were still there in Ukraine. As this was part of the Cold War, make them be a thorn in the side of the Soviet Union. And so they were provided with covert support for years, and carried out sabotage and assassinations in Ukraine. Eventually, I don't know exactly how long it lasted, but sometime in the 50s, they were put down by the Soviet authorities. But it became clear that it was an ideology that never died, because when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, when there was an independent Ukraine, they came back. They were there, um, and they've been growing in strength ever since. People will sometimes point out, I think, like in elections, when Ukraine still had elections, they would get, these far right parties like Right Sector, and would get 2% of the vote. So we say, okay, yeah, they're a small percentage of the population, the true Banderites.
So the right sector is the Banderites.
Yeah,
So
that's
they
why
were
they have various. I mean, there are various organizations. They're all they all consider them followers following the footsteps of Stefan Bandera. Zelensky, apparently had 2 busts of Stefan Bandera in his office. Um,
So that's a very open Nazi connection.
yeah, it's actually we're always talking about neo Nazis. There seems to be supposedly a neo Nazi in every closet and whatever, and they virtually do not exist in this country. There's so few that it's half of the so-called neo. There may be a few dozen, and half of them are government informants or something. It's just a non-existent phenomenon in this country, and I think in most Western countries. But in Ukraine, it's for real, and we're not talking about neo Nazis. There's actually a living connection. These are people. I remember my grandfather. He served with Stefan Bandera, and now I'm going to carry forward the banner. It's for real, and you say, okay, they only got 2% of the vote, but they were like the muscle in the Maidan revolution. They were the ones that that carried out the violence, um, and the thing is, the government understood that. These are the people that made this happen. And we can't cross them, because they can get rid of us just like they got rid of the previous government. Zelensky, when he was elected, he was actually elected on a peace platform. He was going to, the Minsk agreements and so forth. He was going to talk to the Russians and the conflict in the Donbass. But he went off, not long after he was elected, he went off to close to the front lines in the Donbass. And there's apparently, the video footage is still out there. You can find it on YouTube or wherever. But he's attempting to, tell the local people that not the local people, the troops there, what his intentions were. And they just made it crystal clear to him. He said, you're not making peace with the Russians. If you do, it's, they made not so veiled threats that they would kill him. And that was pretty much the end of it. I know Max Blumenthal, and I think wrote some very good articles about that.
If everybody just learned this 10-minute history, the whole sort of veil around Ukraine would just be shattered.
But the funny thing is, it's like, okay, this is not. It seems like some sort of alternative, history, kind of some sort of fringe theory. But all these things or not all of it, but much of it was reported in the mainstream press at the time. Right. And there was even an act of Congress, to indicating that no funds sent to Ukraine could go used to support the Azov battalion,
because they're open Nazis.
Yeah, right. And so somebody pointed, "Hey, we can't do." Oh, yeah, right. We can't do this. And there were articles in the New York Times about what Zelensky was dealing with, and I said, I think there was even an article called, "Hey, Ukraine does have a Nazi problem."
Is the irony not breaking on these leaders in the West? where we always talk about Hitler and how terrible he is, and now we got Germany sending their last Patriot battalion system to Ukraine and giving all their money and letting their pipeline be blown up by the United States and to fund actual Nazis, an actual Nazi government. I mean,
Yeah,
is that extreme to say that it's a
right.
Nazi government in
Well,
Ukraine?
it's okay. Um, my far right friends would point out that they're not really. The thing is, I mean, they've made compromises. I don't know how sincere they are, in their ideology in recent years. They did used to talk endlessly about the Jews. They don't do that anymore. Zelensky, I think people point out he's not really Jewish because his mother wasn't Jewish, but his father was Jewish. Okay. Um, and there are some Jewish oligarchs that even fund some of these far right groups in Ukraine. So they don't really have, like if the Nazis from the 1930s came and looked at them, they would, I think maybe they would see some similarities, but there would obviously be a lot of differences. They've even made some, compromises on things like transgenderism because they see it so important to the West. But the one thing they won't compromise, which has been kind of was carried all the way through, is the hatred of Russians, and it's a hatred that just it is, they they regard Russians as they call them orcs, they dehumanize them, they glory in killing them, they talk about their like Budanov, just wanting to kill Russians anywhere. Again, we're not talking about Russian soldiers at the front, but just Russians, killing Russians. It brings them great pleasure. I mean, this seems to be the core of their ideology, as far as I can tell. This is what's left of it. It does come out of, from Nazi Germany, but what's left of it is just this single-minded hatred of Russia.
Was it because Russia, went through Ukraine first, and then the Germans came back and pushed them back in World War II? So there was already a large animosity towards Russia back then. Like, where does this
Okay, well,
natural hatred of Russians come from? I don't like borscht that much either, but it's not enough to me.
well, yeah, it's a little bit hard to understand. I mean, um, well, of course, when we talk about Ukraine, East and West are very different. This is something that's centered in the West, but it has. I mean, either even I know there was Russian-speaking units that were Banderites. So there are even some Russians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, ethnically Russian Ukrainians that have subscribed to the ideology. But it's very much centered in the West. It has a different history. Um, yeah, because you don't have to go very far back at all. There's a time when, Kiev and most of what we call Ukraine now was just considered part of Russia. I mean, that's how it. Just to give an example, I think Anthony Blinken was talking about his parents or great grandparents were persecuted by the Russians. Where do they come from? They're from Kiev, but that back then was Russia. Um, so I don't get it entirely. I mean, there are animosities that you find. Um, like for the Poles have long been rivals of the Russians, and of course, most recently they were under occupation. There was, the Great Famine, which they call Holodomor, and which was horrible. There was millions and millions of people starved to death in Ukraine. Now, it's been made out by Ukrainians to be something specifically that targeted Ukraine, and I think that's entirely false. It was Bolshevik, collectivization that was carried out throughout the Soviet Union. Now, Ukraine was hit very hard. Apparently, like Kazakhstan was hit even harder, but it was just a matter of, how the local officials carried out and what, just local factors. There was no particular ethnic hatred against Ukrainians, but it's something that the Banderites have used to, kind of to generate a hatred towards Russia. Um, so yeah, it's something that's irrational. There are historical roots, maybe, there was again the western part of Ukraine had a closer association with Poland and with the Baltic kingdoms, and so considered themselves to be truly Western and not part of the Russian Empire. So there was a desire to really draw a distinction. Of course, they speak a language that's really just like a dialect of Russian, and I'm sure they eat borscht and everything else. So I mean, they're really not that different. But we see these things happen a lot of places. There's a group of people like the Taiwanese that want to pretend that they're not Chinese, or and again, in their case too, they want to identify with the West and not be part of Greater China.
Right. Well, I think it was really hip to tie yourself to the West, especially through the 80s and the 90s.
Right.
And even 2000s.
Right.
But now it's becoming, I think, increasingly
that's,
people are realizing it's a bad decision.
Right.
Like,
I think that's the main impetus behind the Maidan revolution in 2014 in Kiev. I mean, so not everybody was there that was protesting was a Banderite, not by far. The Banderites were the muscles. They did the actual violence and carried out the actual coup. But a lot of the protesters were just, West-loving Ukrainians.
Right. They watch Hollywood movies. They like it. It's cool to be. America is cool, but it's not so cool anymore. And it's a shame, that I feel like what we're doing is just so clearly in the wrong that it makes me kind of ashamed to be an American. I like to travel around the world, and I just feel like our standing is going down so quickly.
Yeah, well, I think there's no question. I mean, both of these entanglements of the U.S. have been just catastrophic.
Yeah, has anything been nearly as damaging to our reputation as either of what is happening right now? I mean, it's hard for me to imagine something.
Vietnam hurt. I mean, that was, and it actually angered a lot of people within the U.S. too. Before Vietnam, there was everyone saluted the flag and loves the military, and then the incidents like the My Lai massacre and so forth changed the view that Americans and a lot of Americans and certainly many people around the world had of the U.S. military. So it did damage the U.S. And then there was also, in the end, the U.S. left. You had to admit that it was a defeat. So that was quite a blow, and it had a long effect. I think actually some of the effects were quite good in the U.S. because it made people question, American interventions, and so for a period of time we were really reluctant to do that. And unfortunately, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, we just decided again that we could do no wrong, and with spectacularly, catastrophic results.
Right. I just, if you can go back in a time machine and change some decisions made at the collapse of the Soviet Union, or maybe even after World War II, I feel like the United States could be such a great country.
Right. We could have gone in a different direction there.
Right. If we just adopted that non-interventionist policy.
Right. Like pulled back, said, okay, now NATO, you served a purpose. Great. Either let's call it something else and repurpose it, or just dissolve the whole thing.
Right. Because by refusing to do that, I feel like we and spreading our military bases all around the world, we kind of adopted this policy, the same with Israel, of what we talked before, of just projecting dominance through fear. And we said, this is going to be our policy. We just have to be number one, no matter what, instead of learning how to work with people, help people rebuild, have close ties, have a real, true rules-based order. That's what's so frustrating when I hear of that, like, oh, we got an international rules-based order. And then what you clearly see is the opposite happening, that actually Iran is playing by the rules very carefully. And so is Russia, and doing everything very kind of by the rules. Do this, you struck us, we're not going to sucker punch you back. And the countries that are completely gone wild is Israel by far, and the United States close behind it as well as supporting it. But it's just a joke. We don't live in a rules-based order. We have this rules for thee, but not for me with the United States. But now people are standing up and saying, actually, this is bullshit. I'm not putting up with it anymore. And the U.S. all of a sudden is like the emperor without clothes on, because it can't stop it. The whole idea of its power was, we'll beat you into submission if you stand out of line.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, people are standing out of line, and we're like, sorry, guys, but don't get too mad at us, And so that's what I'm afraid of. I believe that countries like Russia and Iran will exercise more restraint and would never turn into the bully like the United States has. But it just a bad feeling in your mouth to realize that your country's been this massive bully around the world for
Yeah.
so long and just wasted all of our money. We could have done all these great things, and now everybody hates us
Yeah.
for very good reasons. It's just I don't know I don't have a question. I'm just venting at this point. But
Yeah. Oh, no, yeah. That's a very distressing set of circumstances. That's right. Well, I think, right. I mean, to be a true patriot now is to point it out. That's simply to back these policies no matter what and accuse anybody who criticizes, the American military of being a traitor or whatever. That's, that doesn't serve America well. In the end, I think, that's not patriotic. If we want to save America, we've got to point it out like we're doing here.
right. Well, it's just frustrating that there aren't any politicians that are available, at least in this election, that seem to be
Yeah.
viable candidates for a real, true, non-interventionist, true rules-based order
Right.
where we can work in harmony and engage in commerce and everybody prosper. It's not too difficult to do, but I just feel like
Right. It's very much in our own interest. It's not like, this is like some pie in the sky idealistic viewpoint. Not at all. I mean, it's actually realistic. It's practical. And what what the neocons are doing, like this venture in Ukraine, this unconditional support for Israel, that's the pie in the sky stuff. And that's the unrealistic approach, which is just bringing us all kinds of misery.
yeah, and just exposing us our weakness and just leading to the decline of our empire more quickly. But it seems like we only know how to do one thing, and that is to intervene, regime change. We can't be friendly. We just want to be
Right.
the
Well, I
bully.
heard that actually, like now there's a move in Congress to impose more sanctions on Iran, and I don't even know that we can propose anymore. Same thing with Russia. It's just like they all have one track minds, and it's just like let's keep on striking this with a hammer,
Right.
keep on hitting this nail on the head.
Well, I heard that they might try to impose some oil restrictions between China and Iran, but of course, China is not going to be okay with that.
Yeah.
And so, like, if they're dumb enough to try to force countries like China to not do business with Iran, it just means China's going to, it's going to boomerang back into our face like it's done every single time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's actually right. I mean, it's actually just the absolute. The nerve of them and just the utter arrogance, to think that you can simply impose these penalties on other countries. I mean, really,
well,
it's just
really, you should be imposing them on Israel because Israel's the one that struck the Iranian embassy and killed civilians and killed military officials. Clear act of war. Is in terms of moral equivalency, Iran was a gentleman in terms of responding.
Right, and actually, fair warning. Right. It was actually in keeping with international law. If you've been another country commits an act of war and it violates your territory, kills your people like they did, because that consular facility was Iranian soil. Right. And so, what they did was entirely justified.
Textbook definition of act of war.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah, and then the response was very carefully calibrated, directed at military targets. I mean,
no casualties.
A very civilized response. I remember earlier, I think last time I said that maybe 3 soldiers were killed in the retaliation for the Soleimani assassination, but
it was nothing.
There was nobody
That's
died.
what I thought as well.
That's right. So that was misinformation. Just want to say, so there are no casualties then, no casualties here. Actually have been very, very careful. But
I feel the move, the more I think about it, when I was first kind of sort of assessing the whole Iran retaliation, it's like, oh, maybe, it's kind of a win for both. But the more I think about it, I was like, this is a grandmaster chess move by Iran. They really demonstrated their ability, to strike, to put the fear of God into Israel, that they have these very advanced ballistics and that they can overwhelm the air defenses.
Right.
I saw the footage of one of these their missiles and interceptors coming up, and it just hopped around it.
Right.
So that has
Right. It can actually maneuver as it's just on the final approach.
right,
Yeah, I saw that too. That's quite extraordinary.
right,
Yeah, there's still some question about what they used. There was, there was rumors that it was hypersonic, and then other sources say no. And then I think maybe it was yesterday that Iran Press TV said that they were hypersonic. Fatah 2 missiles were used. But interestingly, and they quoted an unnamed source, military source in Iran, but the Iranian military themselves have not stated that. So it's not clear if they used hypersonic missiles or not.
right. Well, yeah, I think it was a brilliant move by Iran because they demonstrated they're able to strike Israel, and they have the deterrence advantage now. Plus, they did it in such a classy way, you can kind of say, to not kill anybody, to give warning that if Israel responds, people will just look at Israel like you're out of control, and people know about the attack on the Iranian embassy now. That this is making it clear why we are doing this retaliation. And Iran said, "Look, we did this thing. Nobody died. It's over." But Israel just wants to attack. I feel like Israel almost wishes that 100 civilians got killed. That way it could justify.
Well, they probably did. That's probably what they were hoping for. I mean, seriously. I mean, because there are those, again, like I've said, Netanyahu himself has been itching for a war with Iran for decades. And certainly many of his allies in his government. Now that he wants to, but there's probably a couple things going on. He realizes that he does need support from the U.S. He's getting a lot of pressure from them, and then also this demonstration of Iranian technical prowess. Maybe the Israeli media and the Western media are just are blowing the trumpets of triumph, but that the experts, the military experts in Israel are telling him, man, you got to be careful. We had, that was our best. We threw our best at it and they still got through. And maybe they didn't even use their best.
But they still want to go to war.
Yeah, they do. That's the thing. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we can end it there. We'll see what happens. We still have that $10 bet for the end of the month.
Yeah.
Would you want to make another $10 bet?
on a different matter, or?
On Ukraine turning on its masters on the U.S. and NATO by, I'm gonna say by June, by the 1st of June.
By the 1st,
that's June. Early.
I don't think it's going to be that early. So yeah, I'll make that bet with you.
Okay.
I think we don't know. I don't know that it'll happen at all. It very well could, but I would think that it's going to be at least a few more months. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll see. $20 now on the line. Okay, Dad. We'll stop there. Thanks a lot.